introduce themselves. So as Cassie mentioned, thank you all again for being here for this great alumni program. My name is Charlotte, and I'll be moderating the conversation today with, I don't have an assistant moderator, but so we have a great lineup of alumni speakers to share their insights with the group today. Once we hear from them for around like 40 or so minutes, we'll take questions from the audience. So if you want to turn your mic on to ask your questions, please submit your questions via the public chat tab, and then we'll call on you. So if you'd like us to read the question out to our panelists, can you send it to me private chat as a private chat? So without further ado, we'll start with introductions for the alumni. Yeah, would the alumni mind introducing yourselves?
Sure.
We can start. Oh,
sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Precious.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. Hi. I am actively at work and working on a report, and I think I've got the sun behind me. I'm not sure if you guys can see me good. Like I'm being blinded here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. I am Precious Wright, 2008 graduate of WCAS, of course. I am currently the Director of Workforce Development here within a nonprofit agency on the west side of Chicago called APAC, Austin People's Action Center. I've been here for maybe about 90 days. I took a year off, during COVID, but I've been in nonprofit literally since Northwestern, and I'll get into that a little bit more later.
Thank you, Precious. Elena, would you mind go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Elena Dennis. I currently work at Link Unlimited Scholars, which is a education nonprofit in Chicago. I am the Senior Manager of Corporate and Foundation Relations, and I've been at Link for a little more than a year, but I guess going back to college, I graduated in 2016, majored in political science, minored in sociology and history, and started in some nonprofit internships at the time, including through Chicago Field Studies, which was sort of what prompted me to move into the nonprofit space after that.
Perfect. Sanjay, would you mind going next?
Sure. My name is Sanjay Sethi. I am a human rights attorney, and I'm the executive director of Artistic Freedom Initiative. We're an organization that works with artists who are censored and persecuted and bringing them to safety, amongst other things. I graduated from Northwestern a long time ago in 1998, but I also did the Chicago Field Studies program, which was sort of, I guess, my entree into this world. And thanks.
Thank you. Can we have Wendell introduce yourself?
Sure. So Wendell Willis. I run the Milwaukee Public Schools Foundation as its executive director. Been here for about 4 years. In 30 days, it'll be 4 years actually. And so I'm actually a little older than Sanjay by a few years as well. So I graduated in 95.
Very cool. Thank you so much. So I have a couple of questions prepared here. So we'll be guiding through that. Feel free to answer it. Just jump in and answer whenever you have an answer to it. So the first question is, what were some of the impactful classes or experiences for you in school that led you to consider and pursue your chosen industry or field? Whoever has an answer can start.
I can go first. I always root for the Northwestern Public Interest Program, the PIP program. It was the deciding factor to go into the nonprofit sector. I was actually really lucky to get introduced to a ton of amazing nonprofit organizations that partner with Northwestern just before I graduated. And so I was able to really start working my career position maybe about 2 months before graduation. And it was a really good experience. I started out as a fellow where the organization kind of subsidized your salary and kind of hope and pray for benefits. But the agency that I went with, Evanston Community Development Corporation, was a really good site for me. And I ended up going from a fellow to a program manager to the interim executive director. I worked with that agency for about 5 years. And then I went on to be a program manager for a women's program at the Youth Job Center, another nonprofit agency in Evanston. And I did that for about 5 years. So the PIP program really sealed the deal for me where I knew I wanted to be in the nonprofit sector. I was a psych major. My independent studies were amazing. I was a part of the PRISM program with Emily Durbin, Alice Eagley. I did a lot of independent study work with her, a lot of good research, working with families, children's activities and behavior and that kind of thing. So the psych department was amazing. And then I always mention this one class that was really good for me. It was about asset development. So literally, I was born and raised in Chicago, but being able to take a look at the city in a different lens and really break up the city by neighborhoods and determine what type of assets they have. And that kind of carried on in my career after the fact, because that's what I do. We recognize what the needs and the necessities are of the neighborhood, and then you develop programming and fight for funding around that to help them. If you see that there's food deserts, there's a lack of financial institutions, a lack of financial literacy, and we want to try to bring those type of programs to the community to build self-sufficiency. So psych program and the PIP program.
Thank you so much, Precious. Anyone want to go next to talk about impactful classes or experiences?
I can jump in. I think while I liked a lot of my classes, I don't know that they directly translate a lot to the nonprofit world, which I think is common going to a liberal arts school, no matter what profession you go into. So I would definitely highlight the Chicago Field Studies program, I think for a lot of the same reasons that Precious talked about PIP. I had a great experience just with the internship itself. I interned at the Chicago Bar Foundation, which is a legal aid nonprofit. And I got to see both sort of the foundation piece of giving grants, but also we were a foundation that raised money. So I got to see some of that. I got to do some of the sort of direct service work as well. And the class that I took as a part of the program was focused on civic engagement. And I got to learn from other students who were in other nonprofit internships or a lot were involved with political campaigns, because it was 2016. So there were primaries at the time. But it was really just a great experience to gain that exposure. And while I did something initially after I graduated, I actually then ended up back on staff at the Chicago Bar Foundation. And so I very much credit CFS with the reason that I got that job. I was the only person they interviewed. They offered it to me later that day because they already knew me. And so I was there for 3.5 years. But CFS is definitely something worth considering if you haven't already.
I'm going to just jump into on the Chicago Field Studies program. I actually did not work as a part of the program at a nonprofit. I worked in investment banking, and it was great because, like, after a couple of weeks, I'm like, no, thank you. That's really not what I wanted. It was my first experience there, or in that field. But what was interesting actually was the engagement with the other students in the class, most of whom were actually working in nonprofits. And a lot of our discussions were about workplace culture. And for me, it was kind of a good introduction of what the nonprofit space could be. If I had to do it again, I probably would have coupled it with a nonprofit experience. With me also classes, I don't know. I think the classes that really influenced me, to be honest with you, had really almost nothing to do with what I do now professionally, the ones that ended up personally mattering to me. But I believe it's still an adjunct major. I think the international studies program actually in general, and a lot of the classes associated with it, directed me to the right place, because it just sort of introduced me to the wider world. Whether it's nonprofit perspective. So that really benefited me. I know that's very niche to what I do, though.
Perfect, thank you. Wendell, would you like to go next?
Sure. So much like the other alums, I think that for me, the classes weren't directly related. They were probably indirectly related, and more so as I got further away. So I didn't actually go to nonprofit right away as well either. I went into employee benefits, mostly sales and marketing, and had the revelation that I didn't want to go from employee benefits boy to employee benefits man. And as I took mentors to think about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go, they pointed out, looking at the economics classes that I had at Northwestern were mostly around social service, social history, whether it be like an economics of African-American history, Indian history, African history as a whole. So looking at really historical lens of the economics of different groups and what happened to them either as they in their own country or as related to the Americas. So, my interest there probably was more subconscious because I spent about a decade in employee benefits. And then as I made the move to my first job in nonprofit was a neighborhood, like a neighborhood community center, like a traditional settlement house, much like a Hull House in Chicago would have been. And so that experience really, their need was a business guy to manage the finances and business affairs of the organization. But little did I know that as you're managing that, you become embroiled in everything that's happening, especially when it's a smaller community center. So ended up managing the program staff and other areas. So I think a lot of the classes subconsciously led me to where I am today, and probably not, for all of you, if you can make the conscientious effort to think about where it's going. I kind of did it by, my first part of my career was by default, not by design. So as I started to design the second half of it, then thinking about what were the transferable skills or things I learned, especially in relating to other people.
Thank you so much. So second question, you all touched on a little bit, but you can feel free to expand a little bit more. So the question is, can you tell us about your first job and whether it was exactly what you were looking for?
I'll expand upon my first placement as a fellow for ECDC, Evanston Community Development Corporation. It truly changed my life. I'm from the west side of Chicago. The city of Evanston is very diverse. Back then, I'm not sure so much if it's so much political now, but they're considered to be, the Northwestern campus to be on the east side of Evanston. And the work that I did in social services was on the west side of Evanston. So again, being able to do some true grassroots development for the area. I was the farmers market manager for the very first farmers market on the west side of Evanston, to address food deserts and to provide opportunities for community members to eat healthy. We actually turned that into an economic development initiative where we were able to hire ex-felons, community members to learn the skills of farming. We built the hoop house. There was a construction skills training piece where they were involved in building the community center over on Church and Dodge. And so right in the back of that center, we had the hoop house and the farming, and they would literally use those vegetables to come and cook into the cafe. So it was pretty cool. We had computer classes for senior citizens. We helped local businesses. We actually started the microloan fund that's similar to the one that Northwestern has, that kind of took over. And so we were able to help local businesses with inventory, with low percentage interest rates on small loans. But then we were also able to give out complete grants where those business owners did not have to pay that money back. And so ECDC was a really great opportunity for me. And I was able to, like I said, go from fellow to interim executive director in 5 years. So it's a really good experience.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone would like to go next?
Yeah, I can just continue our order if that makes it easier for everyone. So my first job experience was not great. When I was graduating from college, had applied to Teach for America, which, if you're not familiar, is a 2-year basically fellowship program to teach in a generally a low income area, often without kind of that education background. And so I was accepted into TFA, and I actually moved up to Milwaukee to become a teacher. I did it because I wanted to really make the most direct impact possible on a cause area that was important to me. And I'd had some experience interning at TFA, and my mom had actually worked as a fundraiser for TFA in Dallas. And so I just thought it made sense to be the thing to do. And of course, it was very tough. But I also think I had not really thought about like what my skill set was and whether it aligned with that of being a teacher. I'm someone who really probably needs a lot of organization. I'm a very organized person. If you go into a classroom with a lesson plan and one little thing goes wrong and it's just all out the window. And I think there were just like sort of a number of things like that that I learned in that experience were really it wasn't the best work environment for me, and I was failing the kids, which of course was the tougher part. And so I ended up exiting the program early. So by October, after the fall after I graduated college, I was unemployed looking for my next job. And so kind of fell into something else, and it's been good since then. But I think, the advice that I would have for students is, one, to really do your research on understanding what is involved with the job, and not just taking something because it's what's offered to you, or because it's, because maybe there's some prestige with it. I think also TFA is a program that comes with prestige, and that was part of the reason I made that decision. But I think also the other sort of lesson there is like, it's okay if your first job doesn't work out. I have found good jobs since then. I think I'm pretty successful for being 6 years out of school, even though that first thing didn't work. So it turns out okay, even if you make the wrong choice to start.
Yeah, thank you. Angie, would you go? Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, just continuing with the order. So yeah, I mean, somewhat similarly, I really had to feel my career out, and with the investment banking thing, because I majored in economics as well. I didn't want to just sort of bounce out, so I took a job actually still in investment banking afterwards. It was the late 90s. Sorry, it seemed like everybody was doing it. So, again, I realized that I made a mistake fairly quickly. And then I moved into more economic development oriented work, where I kind of thought like I was kind of getting warmer, and maybe more towards the career that worked for me. And then I went to grad school, and ultimately there I shifted from within my program from international economic development to international human rights. And I don't know, I think kind of the important thing I took away from that was you're not wedded to your major in perpetuity. Just because you majored in something doesn't mean that, like, especially economics, which does not necessarily totally translate to the business world. It's a bit of an abstract science. So, I think like, millennials can sometimes get a lot of criticism for not staying at a job for too long and jumping around from job to job. But I don't know, I look at that as a positive, because it was a little bit taboo then to, work for a little bit somewhere and then move somewhere else. I think that's softened over time, but I think it's a good thing. You can't have perfect knowledge. It's a first job. You can certainly make a wrong decision and it doesn't have to work out right away. But I think you just have to kind of give yourself time. You may not nail it right away.
Perfect, thank you.
So I would echo a lot of what both Elena and Sanjay said. I think, again, my situation was pretty unique. I left Milwaukee high schools having an internship that was guaranteed for 4 summers with a theoretical promise to work there full time. So I did, and went into employee benefits by default, right? Not thinking that, my assumption at the time was I will just go into this business and work my way up the ladder type of thing. And that was like not true. And much like Sanjay, not feeling great about it, but then kind of went to other employee benefits firms thinking that, like, if you go to a different place, maybe it'll run better or have a better experience. And then having a number of mentors kind of look at and say, well, this is not really, this is not really where you want to be. Like, if you stay in the for-profit side, like, this is your avenue and lane, but you need to really think about this other world, which is, again, a business, just a different 501, it's just a different tax code. But it's not a different, you still could be running a business over here. So, what would it take to be doing those things and making that transition? So I think, for me, I agree with Sanjay. The first job, well, first of all, I think the longer I think about this now as like, a 49-year-old person, if everything works out with your first job, I'm probably a little nervous that really happened, because that's where you're just learning. So I think the biggest thing to take away from your time at NU is, do you have enough critical thinking skills? And can you translate what you've done as transferable to other, entities or applications that you're trying to do as you progress through your career? And can you articulate what it is that you bring to the table? So regardless of how you feel in the job, and there have been many times where I've been miserable early on, especially early on in the first kind of 7 to 8 years I spent in employee benefits for making that transition. Even the moving to a small community center, that setting I knew wasn't necessarily the end all be all, but I had to get my feet wet in nonprofit. But I also had a very understanding boss at the time that basically said, I know this is probably not where you should be. And that was, on day one, but let me help you figure out where you're going to get to. So I think surrounding yourself with the right people. I think the other part of it is, whatever job you're in, really work hard and outwork everybody, regardless of how miserable you are, because people will see that you're driven, that you're a hard worker. So that translates to whatever job you're going to be in next. And so, matter of fact, I just had this conversation with a relative of mine who, we would all say working for like Lucasfilm and Disney would be like the end all be all, right? But he hated every minute of it, quit, and then ironically ends up back over there, but now in a different department altogether. So, but I think the key was like, you don't want to burn any bridges, because you never know what it leads to, and what the other people that are around you, if they know that you're not totally, you don't have to broadcast that you're not happy, but when you have conversations about what I'm thinking about next, they may be able to introduce you to somebody. So, the second time around, getting my feet wet in a nonprofit, as I transitioned, that was much more of a thoughtful approach in thinking about, okay, I don't want to be in direct service. So I think part of that, the jobs you have, you need to figure out like what it is you like and what you don't like, so you know that for sure. But then also making sure you're having conversations, whether it be informational interviews, to think about where it is you want to be. So I think, the reality is my transition, I probably had 70 to 100 informational interviews just to figure out like, okay, what's the nonprofit realm look like, then getting there. And then as I've made each transition, whether it be, from one job to another, I've had informational interviews in between to make sure it's actually where I want to be. And these people are not crazy, or they are crazy. If they are, I can like deal with the crazy that they've got, but I want to make sure I'm not jumping into anything, especially as you get older in life.
Very valuable advice. Thank you so much. The next question that we have, it's going to be like a 2-part question. So feel free to answer as appropriately. So the first question, the part 3, it's the main question is, what are some trends you see in your profession, whether related to the pandemic or not? And that follows up by, what are your organization's expectations for working in the office and or remotely? So trends in your profession and working in the office or remotely.
I'll start us off again. I'll answer the second question first. So when COVID hit, I was with Alternative Schools Network. I have to admit we actually started a COVID team to determine what practices we should go with as the pandemic was starting. And so of course we eventually moved to working from home. I loved it. As long as you completed your Zoom meetings, as long as your deliverables were met, it was much less, even working from home, it was actually much less micromanagement. But there were clear goals set for the week on what you were supposed to accomplish. I'm in workforce development. And so before the pandemic, I did a lot of community engagement, employer engagement. So, putting on the suits and the dresses and actually going out to meet with employers, sitting down with them, talking about what their needs were, what kind of positions they needed to fill, and being an advocate for my clients who I was teaching job readiness training to. And so switching to virtual was, of course, a challenge, trying to get people set up with interviews and advocating for them. But administratively, for staff, we just switched over to working from home, and it worked out pretty well. The agency I'm with now was not able to adapt as well. They really had a hard time. They actually had to close their doors at some point. We have a Catholic Charities WIC Center contract, and so it's you can't sell people food and groceries virtually, right? So someone has to physically be in the building to allow individuals to come in, social distance with your mask on, so that they can purchase their food for themselves and their families. And so I think because of that, because of the different type of programming that's, regardless of what's going on, requires human touch, the ability to work from home is tougher. So we are actively working in the office, and it's working out. It's working out. Remind me of the first question now.
Yeah,
now I'm
for
forgetting.
Sure. It's trends that you see in your profession. Yeah.
Of course. So, like I said, working in workforce development, of course, unemployment rates are very important to us. Pre-pandemic, during pandemic, right now, no matter what the numbers are, we always find it important to provide job opportunities and career industry opportunities to our participants because the unemployment rates are still too high. We appreciate the trends to increase the per hour rate, right? The whole fight for $15 an hour. So that's really good. But we do a lot of advocating for trying to get our students and our clients to understand the importance of looking into career opportunities where they can move up, right? And that can occur across all industries. So, looking at the employment rates, we've had homeless prevention programs. I've pretty much done that across my career as well. Those numbers are still very high. The agency I'm working with now actually just got a $5 million grant to build a women's shelter. So we're super excited about that, but we all know the high need for placing homeless individuals into good housing opportunities. And I don't think there'll ever be enough shelters and programs to address the homelessness rates. What other trends? I think nonprofits are starting to recognize the importance of obtaining unrestricted funds, right? So, that's one of the fears for working in the nonprofit world. Like, oh, every year, I'm going to have to fight for my salary. I'm going to have to, work with the grant writing team. Or if I'm on the program side, I've got to meet my metrics. I've got to meet my deliverables in order to have my salary, right? And so I think across the board, nonprofits are understanding the importance of having a good balance between, state and federal dollars that are super restricted versus, more foundation money and private funding. So.
Thank you so much, Elena.
Yeah, I will also answer the second part first. My office transitioned back to hybrid last fall, where we were going into the office 2 days a week. We then went virtual when Omicron started, and then we're 2 days a week earlier this spring, but now we're actually only 1 day a week in the office, which is a combination of a leadership change, not feeling as strongly about the fact that people need to be in the office, and again, increased cases, but also gas prices, because a lot of my coworkers drive. And so that's a very big deal to them, whereas I take the train. So I've enjoyed that balance. I certainly like not having to commute, because I've got about a 40-minute public transportation commute that I'm happy to do only once a week. And honestly, doing things like this are just easier when I'm in my own space, rather than being in an office that I share with someone and have to, worry about background noise. So I would say, just talking to others locally in nonprofits, I'm seeing very similar trends. Like my last job, they're 2 days a week in the office. And some people might go in more if they need to. But if you can do stuff at home, they've been doing it. I will say our programming this summer is transitioning into in-person. We have a big summer learning program, which will be entirely in a school building starting at the end of this month. And we're really excited to be doing that, because our students that we serve have really been asking for that. They want to be able to connect in person, and we've been doing so much virtual programming the last, 2+ years. But then in terms of trends, I think the one that I would highlight, which is both pandemic related and not, is turnover. I think it's certainly been well reported that lots of people are moving jobs now. As a job seeker, I think you could be in a really advantageous situation, because it's just a market where employers are fighting a little bit more for candidates than they might have been before. But I would also say, specifically in fundraising, turnover is always an issue. I think there's some stat about, like, the average tenure of a development director is less than 2 years at an organization. And that has to do with a lot of things. Often it has to do with unrealistic expectations, which I would say is something that I have felt at my current job. But there are a lot of different reasons that it happens. I think hopefully it does mean that whenever, as students, you're looking for jobs when you graduate, that there are hopefully some openings, because those junior positions are able to move up into higher level roles, leaving those open for recent grads.
So with my industry, you can perform your job remotely, I think, more easily. At our organization, there's a few essential positions that need to be physically present a little bit more, but the vast majority are hybrid or fully remote. For selfish reasons, I am going to stay largely remote, except for important meetings. But I think it necessitates kind of an understanding. It's a different expectation. It's a different skill that employers have to seek out. I think you have to be a little bit more self-sustaining to function as a remote employee better, but it hasn't thus far been a problem for us. And through the pandemic, it was never a problem where we had a remote employee not perform up to standards. And as a result, we've stayed like 75% remote. And I don't think that's going to change, like, ever, at least for us. But I mean, I can't speak for everybody, because I know the nature of what we do is different. I'd actually be really curious, I don't know if there's a way to do this, to find out how many of all of you actually desire a hybrid or remote arrangement, and like what would be the ideal sort of mix of the two. But I know that's not the purpose of
Yeah, so for us, it's a little bit unique. I'm kind of somewhat attached to Milwaukee Public Schools, but not really. Like I have a dotted line to them, but I really report to my board. So, and I'll preface this with saying, after I left the community center, I went to a national nonprofit where I traveled 30 weeks out of the year. Then became chief operating officer actually for the district first, managed 2,500 people, and then slid over to this side of the house. So much different like work patterns. So kind of answering your second question first again, I've been really kind of a hybrid employee since like 2008. And I would say, I got to a national nonprofit that we operate in 22 states, 55 cities. We're part of a complex set of family of companies that were all national. So like 4 companies under one umbrella, all national, all travelers for the most part, other than a few. So I think, at least for me, what was important was understanding, and this is again, 2008, I learned to be adept at working either from the agencies I worked with throughout the country. Like, you'd have to do either work at a hotel, work at the airport, work in one of their buildings, because the work at the national office never stopped. That was almost 24/7. So I used to tell people, like, working for that company was like drinking from a fire hose, eating an elephant, and changing the wings on a plane without stopping all at once. So it was all those things. And if they found that exciting or exhilarating, you should come work for us. If you don't find that exhilarating, then don't. So, I would interview people that would be like, when I come home, I just want to be on my couch and that's it. And I was like, that is not this job or any role we have. Like, there's not really a lot of couch time. When you're on the road, it's go time really all the time. You can maybe do a Netflix in your hotel room, but like sometimes you got to entertain or whatever else there too. So, when you come back home, you've got to interact with the national office folks and maybe parts of their companies. So, I think for us, it was more of what did the day dictate? What did the work dictate? How do you do that and manage that? In that environment, everybody's forgiving because, again, if you're on a red eye coming back into Milwaukee, you're probably not going to hit the office right away that next day. Now, like in fairness, I would, because I was second in charge and people would say like they need to see me. I'd rather just get it over with, get in the office right away, and then bag out early in the afternoon. And if I needed to deal with email later somewhere else at a coffee shop or at home, but that was early on. And then even as COO for the district, I really never had a desk for the 3 years I was COO. It was kind of a weird mix of situations. So I just learned to manage by walking around, and my 5 teams were they're all operational in the field. So I really didn't, other than being at the superintendent's conference room for meetings with her or other meetings with program partners, I really was working hybrid for those 3 years. And then now coming over to this side, I control the team, and I just, we're a smaller group. So it's really, how do you need to function? But I do think that for many of you starting out in your career, I think the biggest thing is, there are advantages. I would say there should never probably be a one or the other, because it's like, there's the in-between. Things are gray, and you have to figure out how do you work best. But I would say many of the organizations I worked in, being physically present to gain information and knowledge from colleagues and to figure out culture and climate and how they work, that is really important. Especially, like I said, working with a national nonprofit. If I hadn't spent the time like in the office with them, I really wouldn't have understood the working of a very complex organization and even the subcultures within the other 3 companies. And then your trends question. So I think that's one of the biggest trends is, right, how we work, how work is done. It's obviously not as forgiving on the educational piece with my colleagues that are in the district themselves. There are many jobs that can be done hybrid, remote, whatever. Obviously, teachers really can't be, but I would challenge that. The prior superintendent and I used to daydream about changing roles of teachers and jobs. And the reality is, right, most people don't leave college thinking I'm going to control my day by a bell. And if you start to look at other educational models, there are other places that don't do an 8-hour school day. That's kind of a construct for parents rather than for students. Do you really, you guys are all in classes. You're not in an 8-hour day for your classes, right? So it proves that you don't have to do that. So I think that that'll be one trend. How do you deploy your work differently? The other one, I think, as far as from a nonprofit perspective, is philanthropy. Both how do philanthropists view what they're doing? How do they work with the organizations differently? So having a very complicated conversation with like some of the owners of the Bucks, because they are billionaires, and they're talking about making different investments into communities more directly without an intermediary, but talking directly to residents of the community and making that investment, and then just telling them like, I need a return on this investment. It's not just like, yes, it's a grant, but it's a grant where you're gonna have to do something on the other side that's different than before. So I think that conversation is different. And then talking to a couple of friends of mine, you know, they've mentioned, and I've experienced this as well, right? We're all on Zoom. Your reach is probably greater and more efficient from a fundraising perspective. So now, as opposed to driving 3 or 4 hours to see someone, which you still can and probably will periodically do, is easier, more efficient to do this and have that conversation. I think it just requires more work to develop the relationship to some degree, but you know, in many instances, one of my colleagues is sight impaired, and to be able to just not have to drive, right, 3 or 4 hours around the state of Virginia to do his work is so much different than before. So, and I think, I can't remember who mentioned it, but the way work is done, again, I think now is an opportunity, especially for you all coming out. You know, I have a friend who's early on had a VP of philanthropy who's been in LA for over a decade, right? But his organization is Lutheran Child and Family Service of Chicago. And so he said, you know, I don't really care. Why does my development head have to be in Chicago if all of his family's in LA? Just stay there and do your work. Come here once or twice a month. We can deal with that. But just make sure you're bringing money into the organization. That's all I need. So I think having the real conversation about what's the end game can make a difference as to, you know, how the work is done and performed.
Thank you so much. I think we'll have to take some questions from the students right now. So feel free to type your question in the chat, or you can read it out. I can read it out for you, or you can read it out for yourself as well. So feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. I can also start us off with the question as you, everyone else are thinking about what they want to ask. So a question that I have is there any networking advice that would be really helpful specifically for your industry or from your experience?
Absolutely. If you're thinking of specific roles, specific organizations, reach out to people. Literally look for folks who hold the title that you wish to have one day. Look for mentoring opportunities, reach out to folks to, you know, have a cup of coffee with you, or, you know, more so nowadays, have a virtual meeting, you know, have some questions available, do some research on their organization's missions and what they accomplished. But networking in itself is a skill, right? You know, not everyone is comfortable, you know, working with people on different levels. Of course, I think for this group, we have a better time with it because we're interested in nonprofits. We're interested in social services. So I think we're all people on this call. So definitely reach out to folks. You know, if there's different meetings, community meetings, town halls, opportunities to learn about an issue that's important to you, you know, show up, ask questions, work the room, learn how to work the room, and make connections. Networking is so important. I always have pause when I do these type of panels because my story with my nonprofit world is just so happy, right? You know, everybody is, you know, have challenges, and, you know, I wasn't sure, and I was scared about how much money I could make or could, you know, tap out at in this field. But I always have to remind myself that before I got to the nonprofit industry, that was a challenge for me. I was pre-med. I was a biology major for 3 years. I didn't work with I was your typical, you know, switch from biology to psychology so that I could graduate on time. And then I ended up in the social psych world, But the transition to get there was difficult because I realized my passion really wasn't there in the healthcare field. You know, I just wanted to be a doctor because that's what a lot of people thought that I should do, right? You know, I just wanted to make a lot of money. But then when I switched over to the nonprofit sector, that's where my soul is. That's where my heart beats. And so it was a happier transition. And then just like I said, working with the PIP program and getting assistance on wiggling my way into the industry, it just ended up working out for me. But networking is important. I got this current job right now because the executive director, my old boss, sorry about that, I might have gone out on you a little bit. The executive director, my old boss of the Job Center, referred me to this position here. So she found me on LinkedIn. Hey, what do you have going on? Are you working? I've got a great opportunity for you. And I got hired. So sometimes it's who you know.
Mhm. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions lined up in the chat here. We don't have to go in any specific order, so just jump in when you have an answer for that so we can get to all the questions. So a question that I got in the chat is, how do nonprofits raise funds and donations? What are some advice for student nonprofit founders? And that kind of actually go into along with another question that we have in the chat. It asks, has money ever been a source of stress while working in the nonprofit sector? So our first question was, how do nonprofits raise funds and donations? Advice for student nonprofit founders, and also has like money ever been a source of stress while working in the nonprofit sector? Feel free to jump in when you have the answer. Thanks.
I can jump in. Again, this is specific to my field, but institutional donors are very key in the human rights field. So, you know, the typical large donors like Mellon, Ford, MacArthur, and, you know, while individual donations definitely play a role, it's the large institutional grants that determine, you know, sort of where the organization is growing. I mean, we've been fortunate to grow through institutional grants, but related to the other question, is it stressful? Or do you stress about money or funding? As somebody who founded a nonprofit organization, definitely. We got a large grant at the end of the year last year to assist Afghan artists and assist in their evacuation of Afghanistan. It's enabled us to do a lot of amazing work, and I'm stressed that that grant doesn't get renewed for next year. That would be bad for our organization. It would be bad for the staffing of our organization. You never want to let good people go. You never want to let somebody go for a reason that's external to how they're performing. And then you obviously get pretty wedded to your cause, and you don't want to stop doing that. So yeah, it is a unique part of working at a nonprofit. There's certainly things you don't have to deal with that you have to deal with a private business. But it's not to say that nonprofit organizations don't have their own sort of stressors.
I can also just elaborate on that because fundraising is my sole job. When Sanjay says institutional, he's talking about foundations and corporations, which is my role. But I would actually say at our nonprofit, individual donors are really key. Individuals tend to be single source decision makers. And so there's only like one person you have to, or maybe two people, if it's a couple or a family, you know, you only have to convince them to give money, where I would say, and so that's really, as we're growing, that's a very big focus for us. And I would say for my job, something that is frustrating is that we can do a really great job pitching a foundation, but if other organizations kind of beat us out on how things are graded when you submit a grant proposal, then you don't really have as much control in that process. I would say sometimes you do with individual donors. But I like the foundation and corporate piece. I do a lot of grant writing, submitting grant proposals. I also manage events. That's another way we raise money. And yes, money is stressful both for the organization and I would say also on an individual level, you're accepting, probably a lower salary than you could get working in a different profession. And so you just have to be more conscious of that, which, isn't feasible for everybody, depending on the rest of your life situation.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those answers. And another question that we have in the chat is that Lydia would love if Mr. Sethi could speak a little bit about his experience of development economics, because she missed the first part, not sure if they've talked about it.
Sure. I didn't actually talk about it too much because I ended up transitioning out, but so in graduate school, in my summer internship, I was actually in Russia of all places. And I was working actually in two internships, one related to development economics and the other one related to human rights, which are, two different approaches to what at the time was very much a transition economy. It only been about 9 years since the wall came down. And there are two different approaches to developing societies. One very focused on, lifting up the economic conditions of the people, and one concerned about defending the rights, and in my case, civil and political rights of Russians at the time, or individuals in Eastern Europe. And I think the tough thing for me was sort of decoupling myself from kind of like the quantitative aspect of what I did. I mean, much like Precious, I was pre-med too for 3 years. And I think the quantitative stuff is what what drove me basically from childhood to then. I think there's a related question about finding internships in nonprofits that I can sort of jump into, which is related to what happened is, at the time, there wasn't much of an internet, so I just found a book that Harvard and Yale put out on nonprofits in Russia, and I called everyone. So I guess it was somewhat informal like it was back then. I think in the international human rights and even the development space, I think there's a couple of things that are super important. The informational interviews, emailing as many people as possible. It's super hard to get internships and jobs in this space, especially if you don't network really hard, because nothing, no matter where you go to undergrad, is going to direct you into that space. You really have to do it on your own. Even after grad school, it was hard to connect to international organizations like the UN, or even nonprofits like Human Rights Watch, which is where I did my first internship. And then I would say one related thing that's super important if anybody's interested in this space, whether it's human rights or development, any international work, nonprofit work, be prepared to move anywhere. Hopefully you have a regional interest, which then you can kind of direct your inquiries to whatever region you're looking at. But I would really be prepared to move like anywhere. And especially given that you're going to Northwestern, there ain't a whole lot in Chicago. New York and DC is very much where the human rights world is focused, and then there's individual organizations scattered throughout. But yeah, that would kind of just generally be my advice.
Perfect, thank you. I don't know how much time we have left, probably a little tight, but if you have any quick advice about finding internships with nonprofits. Sanjay, you spoke about a little bit about interviews and emails, so if anyone else have any other advice, that'd be great too.
Yeah, I'd say right now, I mean, you're probably not for his field in general, but in general for nonprofit work, you're a little bit in the driver's seat. I mean, most of my friends that are running nonprofits are struggling with finding all sorts of people for many positions. So your internship may lead to full-time work very, very quickly. I think, again, having the coffee conversations, making your LinkedIn profile, getting that tightened up, but just informational interviewing and networking with people and just chatting about, hey, how did you get where you are? I'm interested in this type of organization, like saying that to people, because They may just literally, unrelated, at a nonprofit that needs a marketing media type person. They just said, isn't your son a journalism major? And like, isn't he home? You should send him my way because I could use somebody like right now, right? So people are desperate for staff. I think just be flexible on where it is so you can at least get your feet wet. It may not be the perfect nonprofit you want to be in, but you can learn about that organization and then again have the transferable skills to go to another spot. But I think right now, with the amount of people that have left the workforce, that are in transition, retirements, there's a lot of opportunity for you.
Thank you so much. The room is closing, and we'll be having our next section as well.